A flight attendant doubted the black man in seat 1A, but his son quietly said, "That's his jet," and the crew froze instantly. A flight attendant doubted the black man in seat 1A, thinking he could intimidate him with ease. He didn't realize the man's son was about to reveal the truth. That's his jet. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when real power is quietly present. Redden Talver squinted at the boarding pass in his hand, the lines on his forehead deepening as he reread the name printed in crisp, unmistakable font. Dr. Alaric Venmore. His eyes darted between the pass and the man seated in 1A, a sharply dressed black man in a tailored charcoal blazer, posture relaxed, fingers tapping quietly on a tablet glowing with encrypted schematics. Redden hesitated. Something in him tightened, not with confusion, but with quiet disbelief. He had seen the manifest. He had verified the seat assignments. And yet, a part of him couldn't reconcile the sight before him. No entourage, no fuss, just this man and his young son occupying the premier seat on Halcyon Sky Flight 209 like they owned it. "Sir," Redden began, his voice clipped, false politeness stretching over suspicion like a thin curtain. "I'll need to verify you actually belong here." Alaric looked up, calm and composed, eyes steady as though this interruption was neither new nor surprising. He gave a slight nod and extended the boarding pass once more, his fingers deliberate, unbothered. "Of course. You've already seen it, but here it is again." Redden took the pass with only 2 fingers, holding it as if it might burn him. His expression didn't soften. If anything, it sharpened, his jaw set tighter, his stance widened slightly, the way security guards square up before confrontation. Behind him, a few rows down, a businessman paused mid-scroll on his phone, glancing up with faint interest. The cabin was only half full, and every subtle shift in tone seemed to echo louder. 12-year-old Leor Venmore, seated beside his father, shifted in his seat. His eyes, wide but watchful, studied the flight attendant. He wasn't nervous, he was alert. A soft frown played across his face. He'd seen this before. Not the same words, maybe, but the same posture, the same eyes that scanned his father like he didn't belong, like the suit didn't fit the story they assumed. "Is there a problem?" Alaric asked, his voice smooth but firm now. "No problem," Redden lied, eyes still on the pass. "Just a routine confirmation." It wasn't. They both knew it. Dramatic irony wove itself into the moment like a shadow at noon. The man being questioned, scrutinized, and gently cornered was the silent owner-in-waiting of the very aircraft they were flying. A clause in the Etherspan acquisition deal, sealed in encrypted files on Alaric's tablet, named him the legal transfer recipient of this jet's ownership. It was scheduled to activate the moment his boots touched the tarmac in Valor City. But that truth, like most truths that disrupted assumptions, remained hidden, at least for now. Redden returned the pass with a forced smile that barely touched his eyes. "Enjoy your flight," he said, but the words were hollow. The glance he gave Alaric's tablet was not casual. It lingered a moment too long. It wasn't curiosity, it was suspicion, maybe even fear. As he walked back toward the galley, Alaric's gaze followed him, calm on the surface, but inside, something stirred, years of patience being measured again, weighed against prejudice in an arena where dignity often went unrecognized. He glanced at Leor, who was now staring at the back of the retreating attendant with quiet intensity. "You okay?" Alaric asked softly. Leor nodded once, but didn't look away. "He didn't believe you," he said. "Not because of the pass." Alaric turned slightly, setting the tablet down on the tray table. "No," he murmured. "Not because of the pass." The jet engine hummed beneath them, steady and low, but there was a strange tension in the air now, something unspoken hanging above the aisle. Alaric leaned back and adjusted his seatbelt, returning to the glowing files on his screen. Strings of corporate data and sealed legal orders scrolled past. The final acquisition clause was only one step away, his signature waiting on a biometric pad in Valor City. And once it was complete, every aircraft in Etherspan's fleet, including this one, would fall under his command. But here, in this narrow metal corridor 30,000 feet above the earth, The myth of ownership meant nothing to someone like Redden Talver. The idea of a black man in seat 1A, no less unaccompanied and calm, rattled the assumptions that Redden had never had a question. As the seatbelt sign chimed off and a few passengers rose to retrieve books or stretch, Redden returned again, not with a tray, not with refreshments, but with that same uncertain weight behind his eyes. "Apologies, sir," he said, louder now, clearly meant to be overheard. "Could I just double-check your ID as well? Just to match it with the manifest." Alaric's fingers stopped mid-scroll. He blinked once, then met Redden's gaze. Again, Redden tilted his head, trying to smile, but it twisted awkwardly. "Company policy." Alaric reached calmly into his jacket and produced the ID, sliding it forward. Same name, same face, same seat. There was a pause, a small theater of silence between them as Redden inspected the ID and then, again, gave it back with 2 fingers. Lior leaned forward, unable to stay quiet. "Why are you only checking him?" he asked, his voice firm, too sharp for a child, too brave for most adults. Redden didn't answer. He turned and left. Alaric rested a hand on his son's arm. "It's okay." "No," Lior replied, quieter now, "it's not." The overhead lights dimmed slightly as the cabin prepared for mid-flight, but inside 1A and 1B, the air had shifted. Alaric returned to the files, but something behind his eyes had changed. An old memory stirred, one he thought had grown quiet. He was not a man who reacted recklessly. That was his edge. That was how he endured. But he also wasn't a man who let storms build without watching the clouds. And something in that flight attendant's expression said this was only the beginning. The final clause on his screen blinked faintly. Pending activation. Across the aisle, a second flight attendant had started whispering to someone on the crew panel. Glances were exchanged. Lior noticed it first. His hand reached under the tray and gently tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad," he whispered, "don't move. That's what they want." Alaric didn't answer, but he didn't move either. The first crack appeared when someone doubted the quiet man in seat 1A. Redden Talver held the boarding pass between his thumb and index finger like it might stain him. "Sir, I'm going to need you to verify this again," he said, loud enough for rows 2 through 4 to hear. The words weren't shouted, but they were projected, calculated to draw attention, as if the truth of a situation could be manipulated by witnesses alone. His tone was clipped, professional on the surface, but with a condescension that slithered underneath. It wasn't about procedure. Not really. It was about permission, about power, about the disbelief that a black man, alone with a child, belonged in seat 1A on Halcyon Sky, Flight 209. Dr. Alaric Venmore didn't flinch. His eyes stayed steady, hands composed as he extended the same pass he had already offered twice. "It's here," he said quietly, as if resisting the rising current of confrontation by refusing to give it oxygen. The pass was clean, sharp, official. It bore his name, his itinerary, his destination. But Redden didn't look at it like evidence. He looked at it like a test he still believed would fail if examined hard enough. "What brings you to Valor City?" Redden asked, gaze narrowed, voice lowered but not for privacy. "For scrutiny." Alaric didn't answer right away. He looked past Redden for a moment, just long enough to notice the glint of a second attendant, Corvin Dastrel, standing at the edge of the galley. Corvin's posture was stiff, eyes darting between his colleague and the passenger in 1A. He wasn't part of this exchange, not yet, but something about his stillness felt like hesitation wrapped in guilt. "Business," Alaric finally replied. "Private business." Redden raised an eyebrow and glanced at Lior. "And the boy, he's with you?" The question, phrased as if the 12-year-old had somehow snuck aboard alone, tightened something behind Alaric's calm expression. "That's my son." Lior, who had remained quiet until now, lifted his chin just slightly, his small shoulders tense beneath the gray hoodie he wore. He studied Redden not like a child afraid, but like someone analyzing a pattern. His eyes swept across the way Redden's hand trembled slightly as he passed the boarding pass back, using only the tips of his fingers, as though it were something unclean. Alaric noticed it too. That was no longer protocol. That was something else. From the galley, Corvin shifted, eyes flickering between them again before looking down quickly, as though remembering something he didn't want to be caught thinking. Foreshadowing crept into the moment like a shadow behind glass. Leor leaned in slightly toward his father, voice barely audible. "He's not doing this because he has to," he said. "He wants to." Alaric said nothing in return, but his jaw set ever so slightly, the kind of shift only someone who knew him well would see. Still, he didn't escalate. Instead, he gestured again to the boarding pass and ID now lying plainly on the tray table beside his closed tablet. Redden looked down, lips pressed thin, then asked, "Can you state your name and confirm your reason for sitting here, please?" A murmur rippled through the first few rows. Alaric turned his head, locked eyes with the man, and answered in a measured tone. "Dr. Alaric Venmore. Seat 1A. Confirmed. Boarded on time. Cleared security. Traveling with my son to Valor City. Do you need anything else?" It was not the words that made Redden falter. It was the calm with which they were said. That kind of calm only came from someone who wasn't afraid of being proven wrong, because he knew he was right. Still, Redden wasn't ready to back down. His voice grew colder, thinner. There was a flag in the system. An alert. Unnamed passenger in 1A. We're required to investigate any anomalies. Alaric's brow furrowed just slightly. A flag? From whom? Redden didn't answer. He wasn't authorized to. He wasn't even certain himself. The message had come earlier that morning, pushed through the system before the crew had even boarded. It had been vague, deliberately so. Etherspan's interim supervisor, Jaren Vale, had entered the note himself. Suspicious activity possible. Passenger 1A. Exercise caution. There was no name, no reason. Just a ripple dropped into the crew's subconscious so that they would walk into the cabin already suspicious, already wired to see threat instead of presence. Corvin knew it. He had seen the message. He'd read it, felt the unease coil in his chest since the moment the doors closed. But protocol had taught him silence, not courage. Redden, on the other hand, had embraced it. He wanted it to be true, wanted to be right. He needed it to justify his performance. "You'll need to step aside until we verify everything fully," Redden said, gesturing down the aisle. Leor's voice cut the moment in half. "You mean you need to humiliate him before you're ready to believe him?" Redden blinked. He hadn't expected that. Not from Child. Alaric placed a steady hand on his son's arm and stood up, not in surrender, but in protection. His movement was slow, deliberate, like a man preparing for the moment to turn worse. "Let's be clear," Alaric said. "You have my boarding pass, my ID. I've complied with everything. The question now is whether this is about a seat or something else entirely." Redden didn't answer, but his jaw clenched. And in the background, Corvin finally took a breath that sounded too loud in the quiet. Every man in that moment knew the path had shifted. This wasn't protocol anymore. This was theater, designed to provoke, built to destabilize. And it was working, except not in the way they hoped. Alaric wasn't losing control. He was watching, waiting, letting them dig deeper, so the truth would have nowhere to hide once exposed. Leor's eyes never left Redden. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't breathe too loudly. He just watched, like someone who had seen enough to understand how men tried to justify their fear with power. Behind them, a passenger cleared his throat. Another leaned sideways, trying to hear better. The tension was no longer confined to one seat. It was growing, slowly infecting the entire cabin. Corvin stepped forward at last, hesitant. "Redden," he said, voice low. "Maybe we should," but Redden cut him off, raising a hand without looking back. "Until I verify this seat, you'll need to step aside." Leor's eyes darkened, his face no longer that of a boy, but of someone learning the shape of injustice in real time. Something dangerous was moving beneath the surface. The situation shifted from suspicion to something calculated. "Step out of the seat for a secondary check," Redden Talver said, his voice louder than necessary, slicing through the low hum of Halcyon Sky, Flight 209. The words weren't a request. They were a challenge, sharpened by suspicion and assumption. Passengers nearby lifted their heads, pretending curiosity wasn't drawing them in. A few tilted their phones subtly, as though preparing to record, just in case the scene escalated. Others averted their eyes, choosing the comfort of silence over confrontation. Alaric Venmore didn't flinch. He sat still, fingers resting on his tray table beside the sleek leather wallet he had already handed over twice. His eyes were steady, unreadable, but inside his thoughts moved with surgical clarity. He wasn't simply trying to fly to Valor City anymore. His new objective, more urgent, more personal, was to protect his son, Leor, and maintain control in a moment designed to strip it away. The environment was shifting, not because of turbulence, but because someone had decided he didn't belong in Seat 1A. Leor leaned close, his small voice cutting deeper than Redden's bark. "Dad, don't move. That's what they want." The boy's tone was calm, certain, eerily so. His eyes, too sharp for 12, had already seen more than most would notice. He'd heard something back in the terminal. Two men in airline uniforms muttering just loud enough for their warning to reach the wrong ears. "Disrupt the takeover before sunrise," one of them had said, followed by a half-laugh, as if the sabotage were a game. Redden didn't know that. Or maybe he did. But what he couldn't see, what no one on that crew could see, was that Alaric had not just boarded this plane. He had walked into a trap already set for him, triggered by motives far bigger than his seat number. And now, like a match tossed in dry grass, the setup was starting to burn. Corvin Dastrel approached from the galley, his steps hesitant, his voice soft. "Redden, maybe we should verify with standby." "Corvin," Redden snapped, not even turning his head. His tone had shifted. There was heat in it now. Pretty, something personal that had nothing to do with policy. "This passenger's documents don't add up. They're too clean, too perfect." Alaric didn't argue. He calmly slid the wallet forward across the tray table again, the leather whispering against plastic. "You already scanned everything," he said, voice cool, low. "But here it is again." Redden pinched the ID between two fingers, as if it were contaminated. His nostrils flared. "Forged credentials are getting better these days," he said loudly, projecting to the cabin again. A few murmurs stirred. A woman in 2B shifted uncomfortably. A man in 3C lowered his earbuds, listening now. Alaric's eyes locked onto Redden's, not defiant, not angry, but heavy with something deeper, disappointment. He had seen this play before. He knew how the suspicion worked, how it fed itself. He also knew it wasn't really about procedure. It was about appearance, about discomfort, about control. "You're accusing me of a federal offense without evidence," Alaric said, each word precise. "That's not a secondary check. That's escalation." Redden blinked, just once, but his hands trembled as he handed the wallet back. Lear saw it. Not fear, not doubt, something worse. The dawning realization that he was out of his depth, but too proud to back down. "I'm asking you one last time," Redden said, voice cracking at the edge. "Step aside and let us confirm your credentials." "No," Lear said suddenly. The word landed with the weight of a grown man's voice. Everyone froze. Even Corvin took a step back. The boy stood up now, positioning himself just slightly in front of his father, his posture small but unshaken. "You're trying to make him look guilty so you can say you were right." Redden opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Foreshadowing coiled around the moment. Alaric's restraint, Leor's sudden courage, the overheard threat in the terminal, all of it pointed to something larger, something orchestrated. And this was just the surface layer. Alaric reached into the seat back pocket slowly, retrieved a tablet, and unlocked it with his thumb. He didn't show it to anyone yet. Just tapped the screen and let it rest on his lap. "You're playing a role that someone wrote for you," he said quietly to Redden. "The only question is whether you know the author." That line hit hard. Corvin's eyes widened. He stepped forward again, this time with conviction. "Captain Dorn should be involved before this goes further," he said. But Redden wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. He looked around, realized he had no allies, then turned back to Alaric with a bitter half-smile. "We'll see what the captain says," he muttered. He walked off stiffly toward the cockpit, the cabin's tension following him like smoke. Leor sat back down beside his father, but his eyes didn't leave the aisle. "They're not just guessing," he whispered. They're trying to get a reaction. Alaric nodded, barely. Then we won't give them one. Outside the windows, the clouds drifted past in silence. But inside, the air grew heavier with every passing second. The air grew tight as truth clashed with prejudice disguised as procedure. Captain to first class. Immediate assistance requested. Redden Talver's voice cracked through the cabin intercom, his tone clipped, deliberately vague, and laced with urgency. The words sent a ripple through the cabin, silencing conversations and tilting heads. A few passengers exchanged glances, unsure whether to be concerned or curious. Most pretended to stay engrossed in their tablets or books, but everyone was listening now. Captain Merrick Dorn arrived less than 30 seconds later, his gait brisk, jaw tight, and eyes scanning the section like a man stepping into an unfolding emergency. His flight log had flagged a passenger discrepancy before takeoff, just one line forwarded from an internal supervisor at Etherspan. Monitor the occupant of 1A for inconsistencies. Dorn had thought little of it at the time. Now, the tension in the air felt real. He stopped in front of Alaric Venmore, arms crossed, posture commanding. "Sir," Dorn said, not unkindly, but with a caution that felt rehearsed. "We've received a report about a possible seating irregularity. May I see your boarding credentials?" Alaric, still seated, met the captain's gaze with calm clarity. He didn't blink. He didn't sigh. Instead, he tapped the tablet screen resting on his tray and reopened the boarding display. "You're welcome to verify again, Captain," he said evenly, handing over the digital pass. "Seat 1A, Alaric Venmore." "Confirmed." Dorn glanced at the tablet, but his gaze kept flicking between the display and Redden, who stood stiffly beside him with arms behind his back, as if awaiting praise for catching a breach. There was something about the way Dorn hesitated, a subtle pause where logic battled suspicion. In that moment, Alaric saw it. The balance wasn't tipped by facts, but by tone, by the unspoken hierarchy of appearances. The documents were official, but Redden's implication still lingered in the air like smoke. The captain turned his eyes toward Leor, who sat upright beside his father. The boy looked small but unafraid, his posture alert, his gaze unflinching. Dorn narrowed his eyes. "Is this your son?" he asked, an edge creeping into his voice as if probing for weakness in the story. Alaric nodded once. "Yes. I'm going to ask that you accompany me to the galley," Dorn continued, his voice quiet but firm, as if trying not to make a scene. "It's just a standard check to clarify details." "Clarify what?" Alaric asked softly, though his tone bore iron beneath it. "Just procedure," the captain replied, too quickly. Leor's hand shot out and gripped his father's sleeve. "Don't go," he whispered, voice low but urgent. His eyes weren't scared, they were focused. "That's what they want." The boy's words, quiet as they were, landed with the weight of a gavel. Dorn flinched. Redden shifted uneasily. Alaric didn't move. The tension in the air stopped time itself. Several rows back, Corvin Dastrel leaned slightly out from the galley. He had been watching the exchange unfold, conflicted. His eyes, softer than Redden's, darted between the captain and Alaric. He opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated. Alaric noticed him, noticed the way his lips twitched like a man biting down a truth. Something in Corvin's eyes whispered guilt. "I believe," Alaric said slowly, "this is more than a standard check." Redden stepped forward quickly, eager to assert dominance again. "Sir, we've had issues with forged credentials lately. It's not personal, but we can't allow protocol to be compromised." "Forged," Alaric repeated, raising an eyebrow. He slid his physical ID across the tray table, placing it neatly next to the tablet. "You're free to verify that as well. Though I suspect this isn't about protocol anymore." The accusation hovered in the air like a thundercloud. Dorn looked at the ID. Perfect. Clean. Official. He knew exactly what it was. But his mind was already clouded by the vague directive he'd received before the flight. The same line Redden had leaned into. Redden leaned in and added, "It's just unusual. No entourage. No assistant. We were told there might be someone attempting to manipulate seating." "You were told," Alaric repeated, eyes narrowing slightly. By whom? Silence. Then Lior spoke, his voice louder than before. Still steady. Still firm. Why are you treating him like he doesn't belong? Every passenger heard it. Even the hum of the engines seemed to quiet. The words, sharp and unvarnished, cut through the layers of assumed authority. The boy's question wasn't loud, but it struck like a flare in the dark. Dorn blinked. Redden's mouth opened, then closed. For a second, no one moved, and then the plane jolted with a light tremor of turbulence, just enough to make coffee cups tremble and passengers gasp softly. The timing felt too perfect, as if the sky itself had grown impatient with the confrontation. Alaric instinctively placed a protective hand on Lior's shoulder. The boy didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on the captain. Corvin Dastrel stepped out of the galley at last. His voice barely carried, but Alaric caught it. So did Dorn. This doesn't feel right, Corvin murmured under his breath, just loud enough for the closest row to hear. Redden was told to push this before we even boarded. Redden snapped his head around, glaring at Corvin. That's not what But it was too late. The whisper had landed. The spell of control Redden held was breaking. Captain Dorn looked between them all, at Alaric, who remained calm, at Lior, who stood with quiet defiance, at Redden, who now looked more desperate than dutiful, and at Corvin, whose conscience had finally cracked open. His authority had splintered, and everyone in the cabin could feel it. The path to truth narrowed, and every step became a test of dignity. Redden Talver stepped in closer, his shoulders squared, eyes narrowed, hand hovering dangerously near Alaric's arm. "Sir, I need you to step out of the seat. Now," he said, the forced control in his voice barely masking the mounting tension behind it. Alaric didn't budge. Instead, he placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder and gently positioned Lior behind him, shielding the boy from what was quickly becoming a hostile confrontation. The passengers nearby sat frozen, unsure if they were witnessing a misunderstanding or something darker. A low hum from the overhead lights buzzed against the pressurized silence. Then it came, a small vibration against Alaric's wrist. He turned his tablet toward himself, just enough to read the incoming secure message. His legal team had flagged a critical escalation. Etherspan sabotage protocols may have reached in-flight crew. Exercise extreme caution. Probability of coordinated obstruction high. His eyes narrowed slightly. The earlier overheard whispers, the coordinated questioning, Redden's peculiar aggression, it all aligned. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was strategy. "Please step out of the seat," Redden said again, voice rising. "You can explain yourself after we confirm everything." "You're sure this is standard?" Alaric asked softly. "Because it feels rehearsed." Redden flinched but didn't retreat. "I said, Captain," came a trembling voice from the galley. Corvin Dastrel, the second attendant, had stepped forward. His face was pale, his brows furrowed in a visible conflict between duty and conscience. His hands shook slightly as he looked between the captain and Alaric. "This doesn't feel right," he said, voice wavering. "We were told something about him before the flight, but nobody said why." Captain Dorn turned slowly toward Corvin, his frown deepening. Redden snapped his head around. "That's not your place to say." "Who gave that order?" Alaric interrupted, his voice calm, but razor-edged. The question cut through the air like a cold wind. Everyone heard it. The passengers, the crew, even those pretending to look out their windows or into their books, couldn't help but tilt an ear toward the exchange. Redden's mouth opened, but no words came. His eyes darted toward the cockpit, then back toward Dorn, as if the chain of command might offer him an answer he no longer trusted. And then, "I don't think my dad needs permission to sit in 1A, said Lior. The voice was young, but it was not small. Every neck turned. Redden's hand lowered slightly. Captain Dorn blinked. The soft voice cut sharper than anything that had been shouted. Lior stepped forward from behind his father, his chin lifted, his hands at his sides, not defiant but certain. Because that's his jet. A beat of silence, then another, and then the entire cabin seemed to collapse into stillness. It wasn't just what Lior said, it was the clarity of it, the confidence, the absence of any need to explain further. Redden paled. He looked down at the floor like it had betrayed him. His jaw twitched, but his tongue stayed locked in place. Dorn's face had gone still, unreadable. The authority in the cabin had shifted visibly and permanently, and everyone felt in their bones. A soft rustle passed through the passengers as they re-evaluated what they thought they knew about the man in seat 1A. Dramatic irony dissolved into revelation. All assumptions snapped like strings under tension. The cabin wasn't just watching an argument anymore. They were watching a truth unveil itself. In the corner of his eye, Alaric saw Corvin look down, lips parting as if whispering a prayer of relief. A realization, maybe, that the line had been crossed long before the confrontation began. Dorn didn't speak. His eyes were locked on Lior, like he was seeing him clearly for the first time. Not as a child, but as the voice that had broken the chain of false authority. And yet, despite the weight of that moment, Alaric knew something deeper. The situation had not yet resolved. This confrontation had been constructed from somewhere else. Redden was just a tool. The real hand behind this conflict still waited, still watched. But for now, power had shifted, and there was no way to pretend otherwise. The silence after Lior's words hit harder than any storm outside the aircraft. Captain Merrick Dorn stared at Lior Venmore, as if the boy had just spoken an impossible truth. The sentence hung in the air like thunder after lightning, sharp, shocking, impossible to ignore. The captain's mouth twitched slightly, but no words came. Around them, the cabin sat in frozen silence. Passengers who moments ago pretended to mind their own business were now locked into the scene with wide eyes and tight grips on armrests. Redden Talver recovered first, at least in appearance. He straightened his posture, eyes darting between father and son, and forced a dismissive scoff. "The child's confused," he said, voice too tight, too rushed. "This is all a misunderstanding." But even he didn't believe it. His fingers clutched the service panel as though it might anchor him to control. His jaw clenched in cycles. His authority was slipping. Alaric Venmore remained still, unmoved, his expression unreadable. His silence was no longer passive. It was intentional, like a dam holding back an ocean of consequences. He met Dorn's eyes without flinching, letting the weight of unspoken truth settle between them. He didn't need to confirm his son's words. He only needed to wait. Corvin Dastrel, standing a few feet behind Redden, took a hesitant step back. His face had changed, less guarded, more aware. He whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "Valerian Capital sealed acquisition file." The memory came flooding back to him. Overheard rumors during a pre-flight crew rotation weeks earlier. Something about a silent investor, a pre-authorization clause tied to emergency chain of command override. He hadn't paid attention then. Now he wished he had. Then Alaric moved, not toward the captain or the crew, but toward his seat's armrest where his tablet lay untouched. He tapped it twice, casually, and an image beamed upward, projected cleanly into the cabin's airspace. A holographic seal appeared, spinning slowly above the tray. The silver and blue insignia of Valerian Capital, paired with a time-stamped pre-activation ownership code. The insignia shimmered faintly as it rotated. Captain Dorn's breath caught audibly in his throat. He recognized the seal. Every executive at Etherspan had been warned months ago. If the acquisition went through, one specific authorization key would be capable of overriding mid-flight procedures during confirmed sabotage. That seal, that projection, it wasn't just a business formality. It was power. Legal, binding, absolute power. And it had just materialized in front of the entire cabin. The truth didn't need announcement. It had arrived in light and silence. Redden stammered. This can't be. There was no advisory notice. We didn't receive any documents." Alaric finally spoke, his voice low, deliberate. "Because someone didn't want you to receive them." The words didn't strike like thunder. They landed like stone, heavy, cold, final. Dorn shifted his weight, his legs suddenly unsure beneath him. Then a sound interrupted the moment. A quiet beep. A pulse from the back wall of the cabin, barely noticeable, but Lior caught it. He turned his head sharply, eyes locking onto the communications panel just behind Redden. It was blinking. "Dad," Lior said, voice hushed but alert, the panel. Everyone turned. Redden moved fast, too fast, lunging toward the panel to block it from view. But it was too late. The blinking light changed to solid blue, and a string of encrypted data shimmered briefly on the screen before disappearing. Not everyone understood it, but Alaric did. So did Dorn. Someone on the ground had just attempted to push an order through. A continuation of the narrative. A nudge to escalate. To not stop, even now. Captain Dorn staggered, his spine stiffening, the pieces colliding too quickly to process aloud. First, the holographic seal. Now a message he hadn't authorized. Whispers of manipulation. Guilt, pride, and panic warred across his face. Redden turned slowly, his face pale now, his voice soft but desperate. "We were told there'd be a security concern. They said someone might try to impersonate. You were lied to," Alaric said, still calm. "And now the evidence is catching up." For the first time, the power shifted fully and undeniably. Dorn glanced at the seal again, then back at Alaric. He saw the weight in the man's eyes. Not arrogance, not threat. Just clarity. Just truth. Alaric stepped closer, eyes fixed on Dorn. "Someone sent you into this without telling you the full story." And with that, it was over. Every man in the cabin felt the shift. The balance of power had changed completely. The moment of truth had arrived, and the sky felt too small to hide the lies anymore. Captain Dorn retreated a step, his breath catching as the light from the holographic seal shimmered across the panel. The illuminated Valerian capital stamp, unmistakable and irrefutable, hung in the cabin air like a flare in a war zone. For one long moment, no one moved, and then, breaking the stunned silence, Redden Talver surged forward, his eyes wide, lips tight, one hand darting toward the control panel on the wall behind him. "Don't," Dorn warned, but it was too late. Redden's fingers slammed the override cover shut, trying to block whatever message had begun blinking on the crew's communication screen. But he wasn't fast enough. Lior Venmore was already moving. The 12-year-old's hand darted past Redden's wrist with surprising speed and precision. He hit the auxiliary display button embedded on the wall, just above the panel, an old model, designed to project incoming directives in emergencies. The screen lit up immediately, and the entire cabin saw it. A single message glowed in stark white font across a charcoal gray background. "Delay Venmore. Force incident. Prevent landing confirmation." Gasps rose from the cabin like air sucked through a ruptured seal. For a full 2 seconds, no one said a word. And then, in the bottom right corner of the screen, the initials JV flickered once, then vanished. Jehin Vali, the same interim supervisor whose name had hovered in the background of Alaric's concerns like a shadow. The same man whose quiet authority inside Etherspan Aeronautics made him dangerous, not because he was loud, but because he operated in whispers, blind spots, and loopholes. Redden stepped back, his face drained of color, his voice barely audible. I didn't know. I didn't know it was Corvin Dastral, pale and shaking, whispered hoarsely from behind Dorn. "We were set up, all of us." His voice cracked at the edges, but it held something else too. Relief, as if admitting it allowed him to finally breathe again. The facade had collapsed, and in its place stood only the truth. Captain Dorn struggled to maintain control. He lifted a hand, as if commanding the oxygen back into the room. "Everyone stay calm," he said, his voice harder now, but not quite steady. "We're still mid-flight. We must follow protocol." Alaric turned toward him slowly. His expression was unreadable, not anger, not pity, but something far more unsettling, clarity. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like steel. "You said that word before, Captain, but protocol is not the same as obedience. Especially when the orders come from someone trying to sabotage the plane you're flying." Dorn opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out. His jaw flexed. His knuckles tightened around the edge of the crew partition. Lior stepped forward once more, his eyes locked not on the captain, but on the cabin as a whole. His voice, young but firm, was clear enough for everyone to hear. They want Dad to react so they can blame him. That one sentence, delivered with calm conviction, shifted the axis of the entire aircraft. A few passengers began to murmur. The man in 3 lowered his headphones. A couple in row 4 leaned in, eyes wide. The tension that had once centered on Alaric now began to swirl around the flight crew. Suspicion turned. Blame redirected. Dramatic irony surged through the scene like a current. Just hours earlier, Alaric had boarded the jet in silence, a father with his son, carrying nothing but a bag and a mission. And now he stood exposed, not by his own choice, but by necessity, revealed as the silent force the saboteurs had feared enough to attack in midair. Dorn stepped forward again, trying to regain control. "Mr. Vinmore, I think we need to speak in private." In the cockpit, Alaric didn't move. The stillness in his posture was more powerful than any protest. He knew exactly what that invitation was. Isolation, division, the same tactic that undermines credibility and redirects blame. He shook his head. "No, Captain, that's what they want, to separate us. To silence the witness before the record is complete." His tone was level, not aggressive, not emotional, just certain. Corvin looked between them, conflicted but no longer paralyzed. "He's right," he said quietly. "You saw the message. This was never about a seat. This was about stopping him before landing." Dorn faltered. The authority he'd worn so naturally when he first confronted Alaric now felt like a uniform that no longer fit. His gaze drifted to the blinking message still floating in soft projection. The glow cast uneasy shadows on the wall, like ghosts of every decision they'd just made. The cabin held its breath. Somewhere behind them, the jet's engines hummed steadily, almost mockingly, as if reminding them that despite the altitude, the real turbulence had always been human. Redden stood off to the side, silent now, his eyes lowered. His earlier bravado had evaporated into something quieter, shame. Alaric remained still, one hand resting gently on Lior's shoulder. His focus was no longer on Redden or even Dorn, but on the bigger question. Who else in Etherspan had known about this? How high did the sabotage reach? Tension hung like fog over the aisle. Every breath was a decision. Every silence, a threat or a choice. Dorn finally broke the silence. "What are you suggesting?" Alaric's eyes met his. "I'm suggesting we don't pretend this can be handled with a quiet conversation in the cockpit." Then came a small sound, a high-pitched ping for the control panel near the flight attendant station. A new message had arrived. It blinked once, twice, then faded before anyone could read it. But the damage was done. Lior tilted his head. "They're still trying to push messages through," he said softly. Everyone knew what that meant. Someone on the ground was still feeding this operation, unaware that the truth had already broken through the cabin ceiling. The captain didn't speak again. He didn't need to, because the silence that followed said everything. Their control was gone. The conspiracy had failed, and the boy they tried to ignore had pulled the curtain back with one press of a button. The conspiracy finally had a face, and the cabin could feel the weight of its unraveling. The attendant smirked, confident the passenger posed no threat, unaware that every eye in the cabin had just witnessed a claim backed by undeniable authority, the jet itself. If you believe false assumptions always fold when legacy and control are revealed, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Turbulence hit with sudden force, shaking the aircraft hard enough to rattle trays and stir a few startled gasps for passengers. Cups tipped, a briefcase tumbled from an overhead bin, and a tense hush followed, a silence not born from altitude, but from anticipation. Captain Merrick Dorn seized the moment. With a glance over his shoulder, he gripped Redden Talver by the elbow and pulled him toward the galley, voices low but urgent. Most passengers looked away, pretending not to notice. But Lior Vinmore noticed everything. From where he sat beside his father, Lior's gaze locked onto the two men. His young eyes flicked between mouths, watching lips move with startling focus. A second later, he leaned toward Alaric and whispered, "They're deciding whether to restrain you, to maintain order. His voice was quiet, but each syllable landed like iron. Alaric didn't blink. He simply turned his head, eyes tracking the hushed argument unfolding between captain and crew. So that was the play. Corner the man they couldn't discredit. Paint him as unstable. Then remove him quietly, legally, all under the guise of safety protocol. It was fear disguised as process. And it was also the opportunity he needed. "Thank you," Alaric said to his son, placing a hand gently over Lior's fingers. He didn't look away from the galley. Across the aisle, Corvin Dastrel stood stiff as stone, uncertainty carving lines into his face. His hands clenched and unclenched, the weight of complicity pressing down on him. Finally, something inside cracked. He stepped forward, timid at first, then with more conviction. "Captain," Corvin said, voice louder than necessary, the kind that demanded attention, "we can't restrain a man who did nothing wrong. We were manipulated." Dorn snapped toward him, eyes wide. "Stand down, Dastrel." "No," Corvin replied, swallowing the quake in his throat. "Not this time." The air grew heavier, thick with shifting authority. Then a sound broke through it all, a low chime, subtle but unmistakable. It came from the overhead control panel, then echoed again near the front of the cabin. Alaric's eyes widened slightly. He recognized it instantly. The chime belonged to the aircraft's internal network. Not a general system alert. Not turbulence or pressure. It was a coded signal one very few people would understand. It was the emergency override. A protocol hard-coded into the operating systems of aircraft owned by Valerian Capital, designed for one purpose only: to transfer operational authority to the incoming owner mid-flight in the event of sabotage or credible threat. A soft click followed. Mechanical. Precise. The cockpit door's locking mechanism disengaged. Gasps filled the cabin like air escaping a pressurized chamber. A few passengers twisted in their seats to look forward. Others sat frozen. The door hadn't opened, but its unlocking had spoken volumes. Every man in uniform on board instinctively turned toward the front of the plane. Something had changed. Alaric didn't move immediately. He waited, letting the silence mold the moment. Beside him, Lyra looked up slowly and said what everyone else was too stunned to say. "Dad, the plane wants you to take control." Redden's mouth opened, but no words came out. Captain Dorn looked from the control panel to Alaric, then back again, the gears in his mind visibly stalling. Corvin, breathing hard now, whispered, "That sound, that wasn't from the cockpit." "No," Alaric replied quietly. "It came from the system core. Someone on the ground triggered it." He tapped a few commands into his tablet, and the screen responded with immediate authentication. The emergency sequence had been activated from an administrative node within Etherspan server network, most likely by someone trying to tamper with the cabin's control chain. But they had made a critical mistake. In trying to trap him, they had inadvertently opened the door for him to act. "The takeover protocol," Alaric muttered, mostly to himself. It was wired to recognize threat escalation patterns. Captain Dorn finally found his voice. You programmed this?" "I didn't," Alaric said, standing slowly. "But I authorized it." He took one step forward, and no one stopped him. All eyes followed as he approached the cockpit door, not with anger, not with aggression, but with the weight of quiet inevitability. The same man they tried to remove from seat 1A now stood at the heart of the jet's authority system. No vague, no uniform, just truth, consequence, and design. Redden looked back and forth between Alaric and the open panel, his mouth working but producing nothing coherent. The role he had played, the decisions he had made, the narrative he had built, all of it now collapsed under the weight of one misfired command. Lior stayed at his father's side, stepping in sync with him like a shadow, stitched by loyalty. The boy's voice was soft, but it rang out clear enough for the whole first-class cabin to hear. They thought the plane would protect them, but it was built to recognize who really belongs. Alaric reached out and placed his hand near the cockpit console. He didn't press anything. He didn't need to. The aircraft recognized him. Authority hummed through the screen. Foreshadowing gave way to fulfillment. Dorn hesitated, still standing between Alaric and the captain's chair, but the weight of the moment pressed his pride to the side. Slowly, silently, he stepped aside. No one cheered. No one clapped. But the stillness that followed was louder than any applause. And as Lior looked around the cabin, taking in every stunned expression, he understood something no child should have to learn. Sometimes, the system that's supposed to protect you only does so when it has no other choice. The override had been triggered. The cockpit had opened. The command had shifted hands, not by force but by design. The aircraft itself had chosen a side, and nothing could return things to normal. The cabin descended into stunned silence as Alaric Venmore stepped toward the cockpit, not with force, not with urgency, but with the calm precision of a man who knew the truth had finally caught up to the lie. Every eye in the cabin followed him. Some passengers leaned forward in disbelief. Others sat motionless, sensing a shift in the air so visceral it felt like pressure on the skin. The overhead lights flickered slightly, as if even the aircraft was uncertain how to process the change. Captain Merrick Dorn stood at the threshold of the cockpit, shoulders squared, hand raised instinctively, not as a command, but a last attempt to hold on to a position that was slipping through his fingers. "Sir," he began, the words stiff in his throat, "I need you to stop right there until this is cleared." Alaric raised his hand, not to defy, but to explain. "The override has been triggered," he said quietly, holding up the tablet. The glow from the device cast a pale light across his face, highlighting the calm tension behind his eyes. "This isn't a request. The aircraft has already recognized the authority transfer." Behind the captain, Redden Talver hovered near the control panel, arms tight against his sides, his mouth twitching between defiance and dread. He didn't speak. His earlier confidence had drained into something more dangerous, self-preservation. Corvin Dastral stood a few paces away, voice low but urgent. "Captain, the code matches what's in the operations manual. We're not allowed to contest this." The aircraft's own system confirmed it. Dorn's eyes flicked to the tablet, scanning the string of code on the screen, then up to the display flashing behind him. Authorization recognized. Venmore, Alaric, override active. His jaw clenched. His pride fought against procedure. For a moment, it looked as if he might disobey protocol and challenge the override. His voice came out hoarse. "You can't just walk into the cockpit, and you're not listening," Alaric said, firmer this time. "If you prevent an activated override, you're in direct violation of aviation control law." That's not me speaking. That's the jet, and it's watching everything. The room contracted around the weight of those words. Lior stepped beside his father, his presence small but sharp as flint. He looked up at Dorn with clear eyes that saw more than a boy his age should have. "My dad isn't here to take over your plane," he said softly. "He's here to stop the people who try to use it to hurt us." The captain looked at the boy, then at the tablet, then at Alaric again. He exhaled, slowly, as though deflating. With reluctance rather than consent, he stepped aside. "Then do what you came here to do." The cockpit door opened fully, revealing a dashboard blinking red with a series of escalating alerts. Internal interference. Code injection failure. Crew manipulation flagged. The console was waiting for the one person it trusted. Alaric didn't sit. He leaned over the left-hand control panel and entered a sequence, 6 digits, then a thumbprint. A brief chime. The warning lights dimmed to amber. Systems stabilized one by one. Communication channels closed to outside override. Navigation realigned to Valor City. The cabin behind him remained hushed, the only sound the soft vibration of stabilized altitude. Dorn hovered near the doorway, hands clenched in a fist he didn't realize he'd made. Redden's breathing had become shallow. No longer angry, just cornered. The man who once barked accusations now looked like he was shrinking under the very silence he created. Alaric turned slowly, holding up the tablet once more. "This isn't about embarrassment. It's about liability. Every action since we took off has been recorded. Voice, movement, even panel interactions. It's all tied to your crew profile. The aircraft knows who did what." At that moment, another display on the side monitor activated. A message appeared, this time from Alaric's legal team. "Confirm ownership upon landing. Crew actions recorded." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was seismic. Captain Dorn staggered back a half step. His fingers twitched near his collar, adjusting it as if it were suddenly too tight. His pride, his authority, every assumption he had made about the man in seat one, all of it was dissolving in real time. Redden leaned against the wall, sweat pooling at the back of his neck. He opened his mouth, perhaps to defend himself, but no words came. Because what defense could he offer now? That he thought he was following protocol? That he was just obeying orders? Or worse, that he let his prejudice make him believe he could act without consequence? Corvin moved forward slowly, as if his body had only just remembered how to function. "Captain, what do we do now?" Dorn didn't answer. Not immediately. His eyes scanned the cockpit, then drifted to Lior, who still stood beside his father, small and resolute, like a final verdict rendered in flesh and blood. "We land the plane," Dorn said at last, his voice brittle, "and we face whatever comes next." No one argued. Alaric turned back to the console, locking the final sequence into place before stepping away from the controls. He had no desire to command the flight, only to ensure it couldn't be used as a weapon against him. Behind him, the sky rolled on, steady, neutral, endless. In the quiet that followed, no one dared speak, because the balance had shifted, and every man in that cabin now knew nothing could be undone. Not the silence, not the suspicion, not the truth that had risen to the surface. The turning point had arrived, and every man on board felt the ground shift beneath them, while still miles above it. Captain Dorn finally stepped aside, not out of acceptance, but because reality had cornered him. The cockpit door clicked open, its mechanical lock disengaging with a quiet finality that somehow felt louder than all the arguments that had come before it. The recessed lighting inside the flight deck glowed, an unsettling amber, casting sharp reflections across the glass instruments. Multiple warnings blinked on the navigation panel: security overrides, transmission failures, and an alert that read simply, "Owner activation pending." Alaric didn't hesitate. He stepped past the threshold with calm, deliberate steps, his movements unhurried but unshakable. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood behind the captain's seat, his presence steady, composed, like a man assuming command not out of impulse but design. His fingers danced across his tablet as he opened the embedded authentication protocol. Each tap echoed louder in the minds of those watching than any alarm bell. A quiet sequence unfolded across the dash, and a glowing seal appeared in the air, Valerian Capital's owner override signature. The same man they had tried to remove from Seat 1A was now the only one with authority to prevent the aircraft from being rerouted or compromised mid-flight. And the irony was brutal. The crew, who believed they were enforcing order, were now guests in a situation far beyond their control. Lior stood just outside the cockpit door, his face half lit by the soft blue light from the panel display. He didn't blink. He watched every motion his father made, absorbing them not with a child's awe, but with a quiet understanding that this moment would define more than just the outcome of their flight. It would define the legacy of his father's restraint and resolve. Behind them, Redden shuffled closer, his voice trembling with desperation as he said, "I didn't know. I was just following what we were told." But Alaric didn't look up. Instead, with one calm motion, he tapped a sequence that activated the message log playback. A projection blinked to life just above the navigation console, a replay of the earlier encrypted communication Redden had received before takeoff. "Monitor passenger 1A. Verify all credentials. Escalate if uncertain." The message was hollow now, transparent in its manipulation. "You were following someone else's fear," Alaric said quietly, without turning. "Not protocol." Redden opened his mouth to reply, but Corvin Dastral's voice broke through from behind. He had moved to the front, unable to stay silent anymore. "There's something else," Corvin said, voice strained. Another line, deeper in the logs. "I didn't see it at first." Alaric nodded for him to continue. Corvin moved to the adjacent screen and swiped through the message buffer. Then he froze, eyes widening. "Here," he whispered and magnified the text. Everyone in the cockpit read the line at once. "Trigger incident to disqualify Venmore from acquisition. A silence deeper than turbulence fell over the flight deck. It wasn't just bias. It wasn't just suspicion. It had been an orchestrated attempt to provoke Alaric into disqualifying himself, legally, contractually, and publicly. The warning, the delays, the request to leave his seat, it had all been engineered. Not to protect the flight, but to fracture his reputation midair. Captain Dorn looked sick. His hands dropped to his sides, fingers twitching with the need to undo what had already been done. "I didn't know," he whispered, as if that might unring the bell. Alaric looked at him for the first time inside the cockpit. "But you followed it anyway." The words weren't angry. They didn't need to be. They were measured, heavy, accurate. Then, as if sensing the emotional voltage in the cabin, the jet dipped gently into a level flight pattern. The internal alerts began clearing one by one as Alaric finalized the override protocol, locking out any future attempts at interference. Only when the system displayed stabilization complete, command secured, did he step back from the console. He didn't take the seat. He wasn't here to conquer. It was never about ego. He was here to protect what mattered. Lior stepped beside him, the boy's shoulders squared, his chin up, not in defiance, but in alignment. With the truth. With dignity. Captain Dorn lowered his gaze, nodding faintly as he placed one hand on the pilot's chair, not to resist, but to reclaim the role he'd almost lost to his own blindness. Alaric said nothing more. He tapped one final command to return system control to Dorn, under restricted, recorded oversight. The hierarchy was restored, but the balance of power had shifted. Behind them, Redden looked hollow, his authority evaporated by a message he once believed protected him. Now it bound him. The jet held steady. Below them, Valor's city shimmered in the dusk, unaware that the aircraft above had just passed through a storm far more dangerous than weather. Inside, however, every man aboard knew that something had broken, and something had been rebuilt. The man they doubted had just saved the very flight they tried to weaponize against him. The wheels struck the tarmac with a jarring thud, and a brief shudder ran through the length of Halcyon sky. Flight 209. No one clapped. No one spoke. The silence was not out of respect for the smooth landing. It was the silence of men who knew the truth had just landed with them. Captain Merrick Dorn leaned forward in his seat, barely able to meet Alaric Venmore's gaze as he passed. I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice low, cracked by the weight of everything left unspoken. Alaric offered no reply. His expression remained composed, unreadable. Forgiveness, if it came, would not be given lightly. Not here. Not yet. Lior's small hand slid into his father's. It was the first steadying gesture of calm since takeoff. Together, they walked into the aisle, framed in the stunned glances of passengers still absorbing what had unfolded in the air. At the jet bridge, two uniformed security officers stood at attention, not bracing for confrontation, but waiting for Alaric with protective authority. Redden Talver, who had shadowed them from behind, paused, confusion overtaking his earlier arrogance. He glanced between Alaric and the officers, then did a double take as one officer saluted sharply. "Dr. Venmore," the lead officer said, voice crisp, "you're to be escorted directly to the terminal conference level. You've been flagged as a protected witness under the mid-flight sabotage alert." "This way, sir." Redden blinked, stunned. "Wait, he's being protected?" he blurted, voice tinged with disbelief. "I filed the security. You filed against a verified principal owner," the second officer cut in flatly, eyes not leaving Alaric. "That alert was overruled by the onboard override. Your actions have been logged." Dramatic irony rippled like shock waves. Redden finally understood. The uniforms weren't for him. The system he had trusted to back him now answered to the very man he tried to remove. Inside the terminal, glass walls reflected a hastily assembled tribunal in a high-security conference suite. A long table stretched across the center, with name placards already in place, regulatory board members, 3 Valerian capital observers, and 1 empty seat reserved for Dr. Alaric Venmore. Lior was led to a private lounge nearby, supervised by a quiet but respectful guard. The boy gave a slight nod to his father as they separated, calm, proud, and still watching everything. Alaric stepped into the room, and the temperature shifted. One man, clearly the lead investigator, stood and offered a brief handshake. "Mr. Venmore, I'm Darren Cale, Chief Officer of Regulatory Transition Affairs. We've reviewed the aircraft logs in real time. We're prepared to begin the session." The glass doors closed behind Alaric with a muted thud. The room dimmed slightly as the projector activated, casting the decrypted flight logs into the air like a constellation of evidence. The coded messages flickered first: Redden's communication relay, the override triggers, the time-stamped interference directives. One by one, the pieces fell into place. Cale's voice grew sharper. "We now know that the directive to obstruct your flight status originated from an encrypted network used during 2 previous transitions under audit, both compromised. This is the third." A beat of silence passed. "It was Jaren Vale," Alaric said, not as a question but a statement. Cale nodded. "Yes, the boldest attempt yet. And you were never meant to be on that flight." At the same moment, in a room 1 floor below, Redden and Captain Dorn were escorted into a separate interview suite. Their postures had shifted, no longer defensive, but quietly unraveling. Dorn sat stiffly, hands clasped as if trying to suppress tremors. Redden looked pale, his confidence hollowed out. "He said the man in 1A might be a threat," Redden muttered, trying to defend his actions. "He told us to delay, to be vigilant. He said we'd be protecting the airline." "But you didn't ask who you were protecting it from," the investigator replied, not unkindly, but with gravity. "And now your report is in direct conflict with the override logs." Meanwhile, Alaric remained composed as Cale scrolled to the override activation sequence, the precise moment when the aircraft's system had shifted power. "Your timing disrupted the sabotage chain," he said. "Had you not been on that aircraft, this scheme would have gone undetected." A pause, which means, Cale continued, "We owe you more than confirmation of ownership. We owe you reform." Alaric didn't respond immediately. He simply turned toward the transparent wall where his son sat in the lounge beyond, reading something on a tablet, legs swinging beneath the chair. For all the corporate firepower in the room, the person who delivered the first undeniable truth had been a child. Cale followed his gaze. He was the first one to say it out loud, wasn't he? Alaric nodded slowly. He's observant, and he knows when a story is being twisted. Back in the adjacent room, Redden's voice cracked. I didn't know who he was." "That's the problem," came the reply from the investigator. "You thought you had to." The irony echoed across both floors. Alaric, once doubted and questioned in front of his own son, was now seated at a table where every man waited for his word. The roles had reversed, but the stakes had only grown. Cale tapped the table. "We'll finalize the official confirmation within the hour. You'll be the recognized controlling interest in Etherspan Aeronautics effective immediately. Disciplinary actions for the involved crew will proceed according to board policy." Alaric gave a single nod. "And Vale?" Cale answered without hesitation. "Being detained as we speak." Then, Cale added, almost as an afterthought, "You might want to know, Vale said something when they intercepted him at the office. He told security he wasn't supposed to get on that jet today." Alaric's jaw tightened. "That's because I changed my itinerary last minute. No record of it left the legal division." Cale sat back. So the leak wasn't internal. It was predicted. Alaric looked away, thoughts sharpening. There was more at play. Vale had gambled on misinformation, but someone else had fed him just enough to nearly succeed. This wasn't over yet. Not fully. The doors behind him opened. Lior entered quietly, the security officer nodding with respect as he stepped aside. The boy moved straight to Alaric's side and stood silently, his presence a reminder that truth had many forms, and sometimes the clearest voice was the smallest. Cale looked at Lior, then back to Alaric. "Shall we proceed?" Alaric's hand rested briefly on his son's shoulder. He gave a calm nod. "Let's begin." The room shifted from tension to resolution. But it was only the beginning of a larger reckoning that now stirred behind the polished walls of Valor City's terminal. The consequences had begun to surface, and no one could escape the truth anymore. The door to the tribunal hearing room closed behind Alaric Venmore with a soft mechanical click, sealing in the pressure of a storm that had been gathering for hours. Etherspan's senior executives, legal observers, and regulatory officials sat in a half-circle behind the curved glass table, folders open, screens glowing. The air was cold with fluorescent stillness, but beneath the sterile atmosphere, stakes moved like currents beneath ice. Alaric stood straight, his shoulders square, every breath measured. He had just survived a coordinated attempt to discredit him mid-air. Now, he had to make sure that justice didn't just acknowledge what had happened, but transformed it into something permanent. Across the table, Director Kellen Voren of the Aviation Oversight Board adjusted his glasses and tapped a pen twice before speaking. Dr. Venmore, he said slowly, "We've completed review of the in-flight recordings, network override logs, and transmitted communications from Flight 209. All match your legal division's timestamps." A flicker passed through the rows of attendees. Confirmation. Alaric offered no reaction, save for a slight nod. In his right hand, he still held the device that bore the holographic signature of acquisition, now irrefutable. Therefore, Voren continued, "As of 1514 regional time, the tribunal recognizes your authority as legal and operational head of Etherspan Aeronautics. The override protocol was valid. Your emergency intervention was justified. Effective immediately, full control transfers to your executive office." The statement landed with weight. Silence followed, not out of shock, but the gravity of what had just become law. A company once riddled with internal rot now stood under the command of the man it tried to eject. Alaric remained still for a breath longer, then stepped forward, placing the override device on the table with precise calm. "I accept the designation," he said, his voice as steady as steel. "And I'll begin by exercising the disciplinary review prerogative." Voren inclined his head. "Proceed." Alaric turned toward the digital display beside him. The first file opened without hesitation. Read in Talver, he began, "Flight Attendant, Level 3 Service Operations. Suspended pending full inquiry into collusion with unauthorized sabotage directives." Redden was not present, but his image on a monitor told enough. A stiff face, a fading mask of confidence. He had been removed from the hearing room 20 minutes earlier, escorted by internal security after being informed of the coded messages his panel had received and suppressed. Alaric's hand moved again. Captain Merrick Dorn, complicit in prejudicial conduct and failure to report chain-of-command irregularities. Suspended pending investigation. The tribunal didn't interrupt. This wasn't a punishment born of revenge. It was procedure, surgical, necessary, clean. He paused at the third name. "Corvin Dastrel," he said more softly. "Flight attendant, same flight. Granted protective status under whistleblower protocol for disclosing irregular instructions during the confrontation. Further review pending, but eligible for reinstatement with safeguards." A few murmurs rippled at that, more relief than surprise. Then, without warning, the screen beside Voren lit up with a final evidence file the legal team had just decrypted. "New edition," Voren muttered, frowning. "It's an audio file, time-stamped 6 hours before departure." He tapped play. Jaron Vale's voice oozed through the room, sharp and unmistakable. "Push the crew until they crack, especially the one in 1A. The moment he reacts, we file a behavioral report. We just need doubt on paper, doesn't matter if it holds." Every face in the room hardened. The trap had been so carefully laid, it almost succeeded. Almost. He wasn't supposed to get on that jet today. Vale's last known words had been caught by security officers when he attempted to exit the corporate headquarters through a maintenance corridor. That line, spoken without filter, revealed the core of the sabotage. Alaric's presence had disrupted a plan built on misdirection and assumption. His decision to board had not just preserved the acquisition. It had dismantled an entire shadow network within Etherspan. Security officials informed the tribunal that Vale had been detained without incident and was now undergoing formal interrogation. More names were expected to follow. The rot was deeper than anticipated. Back in the chamber, Alaric exhaled. Not an exhaustion, but release. He looked toward the door as it slid open quietly. Leor stepped in. The boy had been waiting outside, seated quietly in the secure lounge, accompanied by a plainclothes officer who now stood back respectfully. Leor's steps were small, but steady, eyes calm. When he reached his father's side, Alaric knelt slightly, not to shield him, but to level with him. You remember what I said about people showing who they are when the sky changes? Alaric asked. Leor nodded. You said the ones who stay calm are usually the ones who've seen storms before. Alaric offered the faintest smile, pride woven into every line of his face. You were calm, son, and you told the truth, even when no one else wanted to hear it. The room grew quiet again, not for protocol, but for respect. Everyone knew the child's voice had been the first to speak the words that turned the tide. Alaric rose and turned back toward the tribunal. I'd like to conclude by activating Project Skyline, he said. There was a pause. Details? Asked one of the board members. It's a restructuring protocol, Alaric replied, designed to dismantle chain-of-command loopholes, increase crew-level accountability, and introduce real-time escalation safeguards across all flights. What happened on 209 should never be possible again. He didn't shout it. He didn't need a speech. The conviction was enough. Project Skyline lit up on the main screen, drafted, signed, and already loaded into Etherspan's transition docket. Justice had shifted from intention to action, reshaping the entire foundation of the company. The jet rolled to a smooth stop at Gate 7 of Valor City's executive terminal. But the tension inside the aircraft hadn't dissipated. It had only shifted. Ground personnel moved quickly outside, yet no one inside spoke. The wheels had touched the earth, but for the crew, the fall had just begun. When the cabin doors opened, the first aboard were not gate agents, but 3 plainclothes security officers bearing discreet silver badges clipped to their belts. They walked straight past the stunned passengers and approached Alaric Venmore with practiced calm. Dr. Venmore, one of them said, voice low and formal. We're here to escort you as a protected witness. The sabotage alert was logged mid-flight. Alaric nodded once. My son stays with me. Of course, the lead officer replied, already gesturing for Leor to follow. The boy's small hand wrapped around his father's with quiet determination. No one said it aloud, but every man who had doubted Alaric now understood who had been in control all along. Inside the terminal, the mood was clinical and precise. An emergency tribunal had convened in one of the glass-walled corporate meeting lounges. Waiting behind the frosted glass were representatives from Valerian Capital, aviation regulators, and Etherspan's interim legal committee. As Alaric was led inside, Leor was escorted to a private waiting room with a security officer who offered him juice and silence, both of which the boy refused. Alaric entered the room with the same calm that had carried him through the storm. He stood at the head of the table without sitting, unfolding the holographic projection from his tablet once again and displaying the sequence of in-flight events. Every coded message, every override trigger, every instruction tied to the initials JV, the regulatory chief, a stern man named Haven Corin, broke the silence. Dr. Venmore, we've reviewed the live data feed from the aircraft. It confirms your ownership override was properly activated. The sabotage alert originated from Etherspan's own server. Do you have a statement before we proceed? Alaric didn't respond immediately. He turned slightly, his eyes resting on the panel of men who had been appointed to judge what had occurred. My only statement is this, he said, voice level. A system designed to protect its passengers should never be twisted into a weapon of intimidation. What happened in the air was not a failure of technology. It was a failure of character. That set the tone. Over the next 2 hours, every element of the conspiracy unraveled with forensic clarity. The coded directive telling Redden Talver to provoke Alaric. The override accidentally triggered by the saboteurs themselves. The cockpit monitor logs. And then came the unexpected twist. Play this, said one of Alaric's legal aides, handing over an audio file time-stamped 4:16 a.m. Static crackled, followed by the voice of Jaren Vale. I don't care how you do it. Push the crew until they crack. We delay in midair. We delay the signature. That's the only way. Gasps cut through the room like broken glass. Even a regulatory board leaned back in their chairs. The sabotage hadn't been speculative. It had been orchestrated. Within minutes, a call came through from the downtown Etherspan Tower. Vale had attempted to flee the premises, but had been stopped by internal security. He was in custody, muttering incoherently. One phrase, however, had been heard clearly by the arresting officer. He wasn't supposed to get on that jet today. Back at the lounge, Lior sat still in the leather chair, staring at the floor. When Alaric returned to him, he stood quietly. "Is it over?" Lior asked. "Not yet," Alaric said. But the truth did what it always does. It made noise. Later that afternoon, the tribunal issued its formal ruling. Alaric Venmore was now the official operational leader and legal owner of Etherspan Aeronautics. His authority was unchallenged. More importantly, he was given power to enact disciplinary action as he saw fit, within corporate governance protocols. He used it sparingly. Redentalver and Captain Dorn were both suspended pending final investigation. Dorn had shown hesitation. Reden had not. Corvin Dastrel, on the other hand, was granted immunity and formal protection status for his whistleblowing efforts during the flight. Alaric's final act that day was quiet but seismic. Inside the operations chamber of Etherspan HQ, he opened a classified file labeled Project Skyline and tapped the confirmation prompt. Immediately, internal reform systems began deployment, restructuring crew authority hierarchies, encrypting internal directive trails, and eliminating procedural loopholes that had allowed Vale to hijack command layers. A few weeks passed, and with them, the mood of the company changed. Etherspan Aeronautics, once seen as bureaucratic and brittle, began reshaping its internal culture. Oversight systems were streamlined. Every directive now had to pass through a dual confirmation ethics protocol. Suspicion-driven escalation was replaced with context-based restraint training. The ghosts of the sabotage were being exorcised from the inside out. Captain Dorn requested a private meeting. It wasn't immediate. He waited months. But when he sat across from Alaric in the boardroom, he didn't wear his uniform. He wore a dark coat and a quieter face. "I came to say I'm sorry," Dorn said. "I didn't know the whole picture, but I should have known enough." Alaric studied him for a long moment before nodding once. Leadership doesn't begin when you have all the facts. It begins when you refuse to be blind to what's in front of you. Dorn nodded. He left with nothing more than that. Reden's path ended differently. His involvement was deemed too proactive, too eager. The tribunal ruled that his decisions had gone beyond compliance. They had been fueled by bias and ambition. He was permanently removed from aviation service. Jaron Vale's trial began shortly after. His confession implicated several others, but it was his own words, recorded, replayed, undeniable, that secured the verdict. He would never work in aerospace again. More importantly, his exposure led to a national review of corporate acquisition protocols across the airline industry. And then came the final twist. One morning, without fanfare, the board presented Alaric with a small box and a letter. Inside was an honorary certificate carefully engraved. But it wasn't for him. It was for Lior Venmore. The boy accepted it in the privacy of his father's office. No cameras, no speeches, just a plaque and a line of text that read, "In recognition of courage beyond years." Lior turned it over in his hands, then looked up at his father. "I just told the truth," he said. Alaric smiled, not the public smile, not the restrained one, the real one, the one that only Lior ever saw. Because the truth, spoken by a child, had undone a conspiracy built by grown men. In the end, the jet that had once been a battleground became a symbol of renewal, and Seat 1A became a reminder that dignity must never depend on appearance. The sky had tested them, but the truth had carried them safely home. The cabin froze as the captain and crew recognized the ownership, the doubt evaporating instantly, and respect enforced without a single word. If you believe true authority protects its own and strikes with quiet certainty, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights prejudice, assumptions, and the moment accountability and truth confront ignorance. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, respect, and recognizing authority and dignity in every individual.